In the nursery of a respectable London home in 1847, a mother carefully measured drops of dark liquid into her crying infant's bottle, believing she was offering comfort and relief, never knowing she was slowly poisoning the child she loved more than life itself. The bottle that sat on Elizabeth Hartley's dressing table was elegant, made of cobalt blue glass with a delicate stopper, the kind of container that might hold perfume or some precious cosmetic. But the label, printed in ornate Victorian script, read, "Godfrey's Cordial for the relief of infant distress." Inside was a mixture of opium, treacle, and spices that would be considered child abuse today, but was in 1847 not just acceptable but recommended by doctors, pharmacists, and experienced mothers throughout England. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Elizabeth was 26 years old, the wife of a prosperous merchant, living in a comfortable townhouse in Bloomsbury. She had everything a Victorian woman was supposed to want: a devoted husband, a well-appointed home, servants to manage the household, and now, after 3 years of marriage, a baby daughter named Caroline. She should have been perfectly happy. She should have been the image of maternal contentment that filled the pages of ladies' magazines and moral instruction books. Instead, she was exhausted beyond anything she'd imagined possible, worried constantly, and tormented by the gap between what motherhood was supposed to be and what she was actually experiencing. Caroline had been a difficult baby from birth. She cried for hours at a time, her small face turning red with the effort, her body rigid with what the doctor called colic, but what might have been any number of digestive issues common in infants. She slept poorly, waking every hour or two through the night, leaving Elizabeth stumbling through her days in a fog of fatigue. The doctor, a respected physician who attended many of the best families in the neighborhood, had recommended Godfrey's Cordial. "All the mothers use it," he'd assured Elizabeth. "Perfectly safe, perfectly normal. Just a few drops when the child is fretful. It will soothe her nerves and allow both of you to rest." Elizabeth had hesitated at first. Opium. She knew the word, knew it was associated with something dangerous, something foreign and exotic. But the doctor had been so reassuring, and the preparation was sold openly in every chemist's shop, advertised in newspapers, recommended in household guides. If it were truly dangerous, surely it wouldn't be so readily available. And it worked. That was the terrible, seductive truth. When Elizabeth gave Caroline a few drops of Godfrey's Cordial, the baby stopped crying. Her small body relaxed. Her eyes became heavy-lidded and peaceful. She slept for hours at a stretch, allowing Elizabeth to sleep as well, to regain some measure of her sanity and strength. It seemed like a miracle. A few drops of dark liquid transformed a screaming, miserable infant into a peaceful, sleeping angel. What mother wouldn't be grateful for such relief? But there were things Elizabeth didn't understand, couldn't understand, because no one had told her the full truth about what she was giving her daughter. Each dose of Godfrey's Cordial contained a significant amount of opium, enough to sedate an adult, given to an infant whose tiny body had no tolerance for such a powerful narcotic. The peaceful sleep she observed wasn't natural infant rest. It was narcotic stupor. And with each dose, Caroline's small body was developing a dependency, a physical need for the opium that would make her increasingly irritable and difficult when the drug wore off, creating a cycle that demanded more and more of the cordial. Elizabeth didn't know this. She thought she was being a good mother, following medical advice, doing what was best for her child. The tragedy wasn't her ignorance. The tragedy was that an entire medical and commercial system had been designed to keep her ignorant, to profit from her desperation and her desire to be a good mother. To understand how this happened, how a society could systematically drug its infants, while considering itself civilized and enlightened, we need to look at the broader context of Victorian medicine, the opium trade, and the particular pressures faced by Victorian mothers. Opium had been used medicinally for thousands of years. Ancient Sumerians called it the joy plant. Greek and Roman physicians prescribed it for pain and sleeplessness. By the medieval period, opium was a standard item in European pharmacopoeias. valued for its ability to relieve suffering and induce calm. But opium's use exploded in the 18th and 19th centuries, driven by two major factors: Britain's involvement in the opium trade with China and the development of new opium-based pharmaceutical preparations that made the drug easier to consume and market. The British East India Company cultivated opium poppies in India, processed the raw opium, and exported it to China, where it was smoked recreationally. This trade was fantastically profitable for Britain, even though it was causing widespread addiction in China and was technically illegal under Chinese law. When China tried to stop the opium trade, Britain went to war twice to force Chinese ports to remain open to opium imports. These opium wars, fought in 1839, 1842, and 1856-1860, demonstrated how central the opium trade had become to British economic interests. The profits from this trade made opium abundant and cheap in Britain itself. Raw opium could be purchased in any market, at any chemist's shop, with no restrictions whatsoever. It was cheaper than beer, easier to store, and legal for anyone of any age to buy and use. Doctors and chemists created numerous preparations from opium, each marketed for specific purposes. Laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was the most common, used for everything from headaches to menstrual cramps to tuberculosis. Dover's powder combined opium with ipecac and was marketed for fever and pain. Paregoric mixed opium with camphor and other ingredients for digestive complaints. And then there were the preparations specifically marketed for children and infants. Godfrey's cordial, Atkinson's infant's preservative, Street's infant's quietness, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, and dozens of others. The names alone tell a story of what parents were looking for: preservation, quietness, soothing, comfort. And every single one of these products contained opium. The labels rarely mentioned opium directly. They would list ingredients like tincture of opium or anodyne, or simply pharmaceutical preparations, using terminology that obscured the active ingredient. Parents who could read might know generally that these products contained something calming, but many were functionally illiterate or didn't understand medical terminology. They simply trusted that products sold openly in shops and recommended by doctors must be safe. The marketing of these products was sophisticated for its time. Advertisements appeared in newspapers and magazines, in household guides and ladies' periodicals. Testimonials from satisfied mothers described miraculous transformations of fretful babies into peaceful angels. Doctors and chemists provided endorsements. The products were given names that suggested medical authority and maternal care. What the advertisements never mentioned were the side effects, the risks, the growing evidence that these products were causing widespread harm. Victorian England was experiencing what we would now recognize as a public health crisis. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high, with perhaps 1 in 4 children dying before their 5th birthday in working-class areas, slightly better but still appalling rates among the middle and upper classes. Many of these deaths were attributed to convulsions, teething, failure to thrive, or mysterious infant death, vague diagnoses that might have masked opium poisoning. Doctors and reformers began to notice patterns. Infants who were regularly given soothing syrups became increasingly lethargic, failed to gain weight properly, seemed stupefied and unresponsive. When the syrups were withdrawn, the babies became irritable and restless, crying inconsolably, symptoms that seemed to confirm they needed more of the medicine, creating a vicious cycle. In manufacturing districts where working mothers relied heavily on opiate-soothing syrups so they could return to factory work, infant mortality rates were particularly high. In some textile towns, it was estimated that the majority of infants were regularly dosed with opium-based preparations. But this information spread slowly, and even when concerns were raised, they were often dismissed or minimized. The opium trade was too profitable, the products too popular, the cultural acceptance too deep for easy change. Elizabeth Hartley, in her Bloomsbury townhouse, knew none of this. She knew only that Godfrey's cordial helped her daughter sleep, helped her cope with the overwhelming demands of new motherhood, helped her present the image of serene maternal competence that society expected. Her days followed a routine that was supposed to be natural and fulfilling, but that often felt like performance. She woke early, nursed Caroline, then handed the baby to the nursemaid while she dressed and breakfasted. Mid-morning, she would spend time with Caroline, playing with her, singing to her, performing all the activities that motherhood manuals recommended. When Caroline became fretful, a few drops of cordial would calm her. Afternoons were for social calls or receiving visitors, and Caroline needed to be quiet and well-behaved during these times. More cordial ensured the baby would sleep peacefully in her cradle while Elizabeth entertained guests in the drawing room. Evenings, Elizabeth's husband Edward returned from his counting house, expecting a peaceful home, a pleasant dinner, and a wife who was not exhausted or distressed. The cordial made this possible, transformed the reality of infant care into something manageable, something that fit the Victorian ideal of domestic tranquility. Elizabeth sometimes felt uneasy about how much she relied on the cordial, about how quickly Caroline had gone from a few drops occasionally to a few drops several times daily. But everyone assured her it was normal, necessary, perfectly safe. The doctor continued to recommend it. Her mother, visiting from the countryside, mentioned that she'd used similar preparations for Elizabeth and her siblings, and they'd all survived perfectly well, hadn't they? What Elizabeth didn't know was that her unease was justified, that her instincts were warning her of something true even though all the authorities around her denied it. Caroline, at 6 months old, was small for her age, below the expected weight for an infant her age. She was often listless and unresponsive, her eyes glazed and unfocused. When she was awake and not under the influence of the cordial, she cried frantically, her small body trembling, symptoms that were actually opiate withdrawal, but that everyone interpreted as natural infant fretfulness requiring more medicine. The cycle was insidious. Each dose of cordial made Caroline temporarily peaceful, but increased her body's dependency on opium. When the effects wore off, she experienced withdrawal symptoms that seemed like illness or distress, prompting another dose. The more cordial she received, the more she needed, and the more profound the withdrawal symptoms became. Elizabeth was trapped in this cycle without realizing it existed. She thought she was responding to her daughter's natural needs. She was actually responding to addiction symptoms that she was creating and perpetuating. This dynamic, mothers unknowingly creating the very problems they were trying to solve, was playing out in households across Britain and increasingly in America and other Western countries where similar opiate-based patent medicines were popular. The scale of opiate use in Victorian society is difficult for modern people to comprehend. Opium wasn't considered a dangerous drug, it was considered medicine. It was as common in Victorian households as aspirin in modern ones. Most middle-class homes had laudanum in the medicine cabinet. Working-class families bought penny sticks of raw opium at the market. Chemists dispensed opiate preparations for dozens of common complaints. Doctors prescribed opium liberally, for pain certainly, but also for anxiety, insomnia, melancholy, hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis applied to women with various complaints, consumption, diarrhea, and countless other conditions. It was seen as a panacea, a cure-all that could address almost any medical problem. This widespread use had several consequences. First, addiction was rampant, though not usually recognized as such. People who'd been taking laudanum for years for some chronic complaint would find themselves unable to stop, feeling ill and anxious when they tried to reduce their dose. But this was interpreted as evidence that they still needed the medicine, not as addiction. Second, accidental overdoses were common. Opium's potency varied depending on source and preparation, making proper dosing difficult. Someone might take their usual dose of laudanum, not realizing this particular bottle was stronger than previous ones, and suffer respiratory depression or death. Children who found and drank laudanum bottles died regularly enough that newspapers reported such cases with numbing frequency. Third, infant dosing was particularly dangerous because babies and young children are extremely sensitive to opiates. An amount that would merely sedate an adult could be lethal to a baby. Yet products like Godfrey's cordial were being given to infants daily, multiple times per day, with no clear guidance on safe dosing or warnings about cumulative effects. Some medical reformers tried to raise alarm about this situation. In 1843, Dr. Thomas Walkley, founder of the Lancet Medical Journal, published investigations into patent medicines marketed for infants, revealing that many contained dangerous levels of opium. He called for regulation, for mandatory labeling, for restrictions on who could purchase opiate preparations. His calls were largely ignored. The patent medicine industry was too powerful, too profitable. Chemists and pharmacists relied on these products for significant portions of their income. Doctors had few alternative treatments to offer for the myriad complaints for which they prescribed opium. And most importantly, consumers didn't want to give up products they'd come to rely on. This resistance to regulation was strongest when it came to medicines for infants. Mothers, particularly working-class mothers who had to work long hours and couldn't afford live-in nurses, absolutely depended on soothing syrups to make life manageable. The prospect of losing access to these products was terrifying. Middle-class mothers like Elizabeth might have help with childcare, but they faced different pressures. Victorian ideology held that motherhood was a woman's highest calling, that maternal love was natural and instinctive, that good mothers found joy and fulfillment in caring for their children. This ideology left no room for admitting struggle, exhaustion, or ambivalence about motherhood. A mother who complained about the difficulties of infant care was seen as failing at her most important duty. A mother who admitted she couldn't soothe her crying baby without chemical assistance was implicitly acknowledging inadequacy. So mothers suffered silently, or they used the widely available opiate preparations and told themselves and others that everything was fine, that motherhood was indeed the blessed state society said it was. Elizabeth's own mother had embodied this ideal. When Elizabeth was growing up, her mother had seemed infinitely patient, always calm, always nurturing. It was only now, years later, that Elizabeth's mother casually mentioned using calming drops for her children, revealing the hidden tool that had made her legendary patience possible. This pattern of silence and concealment meant that each generation of mothers learned to use opiate preparations without understanding what they were doing, without recognizing the risks, without having honest conversations about the realities of infant care. The medical establishment bore significant responsibility for this situation. Doctors in the mid-19th century had limited effective treatments for most conditions. They couldn't cure tuberculosis or typhoid or cholera. They couldn't reliably prevent infection. Childbirth was dangerous. Childhood illnesses were often fatal, and pain was an inevitable part of life. Opium was one of the few drugs that actually worked, that reliably produced observable effects. It didn't cure diseases, but it made suffering bearable. For doctors who often felt helpless in the face of illness and death, opium offered something they could prescribe that would genuinely help, at least in the short term. This made doctors reluctant to acknowledge opium's dangers. If they couldn't prescribe opium for pain, insomnia, anxiety, and countless other complaints, what could they offer? The alternatives were limited. Alcohol, which came with its own problems, various herbal preparations of uncertain effectiveness, or simply telling patients there was nothing to be done. So doctors continued to prescribe opium liberally, continued to recommend products like Godfrey's cordial, continued to assure worried mothers that these preparations were safe and beneficial. Some undoubtedly believed this. Others probably had private doubts but lacked alternatives or feared losing patients to other doctors who would be more accommodating. The situation was particularly fraught for female patients and children because Victorian medical theory held that women and children were especially susceptible to nervous disorders, hysteria, and various vague complaints. The cure for these conditions was often rest, quiet, and sedatives. Opium fit perfectly into this treatment paradigm. Women who complained of anxiety, depression, or exhaustion were routinely prescribed laudanum for their nerves. Women who struggled with menstrual pain were given opiate preparations. Women suffering from what we'd now recognize as postpartum depression were dosed with opiates to calm their distress. This had the effect of medicating women into compliance with social expectations. A woman overwhelmed by the demands of managing a large household? Laudanum. A woman unhappy in her marriage? Laudanum. A woman who wanted more from life than endless domesticity? Laudanum. The drug didn't solve any underlying problems, but it made women quieter, more docile, less likely to complain or challenge their circumstances. It's impossible to know how many Victorian women spent their lives in a laudanum haze, their potential dulled, their unhappiness medicated rather than addressed. For children, opiate preparations were prescribed for teething pain, colic, coughs, any fretfulness or crying. Victorian parents were advised to keep children calm and quiet, not to overstimulate them, to encourage docility and obedience. Opiate preparations helped achieve these goals. In working-class families, the use of soothing syrups was even more prevalent. A woman working 12-hour shifts in a textile mill couldn't bring her infant to work and couldn't afford to hire help. The solution was to leave the baby with an older child or elderly relative and provide a bottle of soothing syrup to keep the infant quiet throughout the day. Some factories had on-site nurseries, but these were often just rooms where infants were left, sometimes 20 or 30 babies in the care of 1 or 2 attendants. The only way to manage that many infants was to keep them heavily sedated. Bottles of opiate syrup were as essential as milk in these workplace nurseries. The human cost of this system is incalculable. How many infants died from opiate overdoses, recorded in death registries as convulsions or failure to thrive? How many children grew up with developmental problems caused by early opiate exposure? How many became addicted by the time they could walk? Their small bodies depended on drugs before they were old enough to understand. Some reformers tried to document this cost. In the 1840s and 1850s, several investigations were conducted in manufacturing districts, interviewing chemists about how much soothing syrup they sold, talking to mothers about their use of these products, examining infant mortality statistics. The findings were damning. In some textile towns, chemists reported selling gallons of soothing syrup weekly. Mothers admitted to dosing their infants multiple times daily. Infant mortality rates in these areas were significantly higher than in areas where opiate use was less common. But these investigations, though widely publicized in reform circles, didn't lead to immediate change. The barriers were too substantial. The patent medicine industry was powerful and profitable. Doctors were reluctant to give up their most effective treatment. Working mothers had no alternatives for childcare, and the broader society was unwilling to confront the contradiction between idealized visions of motherhood and the harsh realities many mothers faced. Change, when it finally came, was gradual and incomplete. It began with increasing medical recognition of addiction as a disease, with growing understanding of opium's dangers, with reform movements pushing for pharmaceutical regulation. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 in Britain was a first step, requiring that poisons, including opium, be sold only by licensed pharmacists and that containers be labeled with the word poison. But this law had significant loopholes. It didn't apply to patent medicines, which continued to contain opium without clear labeling. It didn't restrict who could purchase opium, only who could sell it. Still, the 1868 Act represented a shift in thinking, an acknowledgement that unrestricted access to powerful drugs was causing harm. It would take several more decades, well into the early 20th century, before truly effective pharmaceutical regulation was implemented in Britain and America. For Elizabeth Hartley in 1847, these future reforms were unknown and unimaginable. She lived in a world where opiate use was normal, where Godfrey's cordial was as innocuous as sugar water, where trusting medical authorities seemed like the responsible thing to do. But cracks were beginning to appear in that trust. Caroline, now nearly a year old, was not thriving. She'd learned to sit up, but hadn't yet attempted to crawl. Her movements were sluggish, her expression often blank. She rarely smiled or laughed. She seemed, Elizabeth thought, with growing unease, somehow absent, as if she were present in body, but not fully engaged with the world around her. Elizabeth mentioned these concerns to her doctor during a routine visit. He examined Caroline, noted her small size and her lethargy, and suggested increasing her dose of Godfrey's cordial. "She's clearly distressed," he said. "Her nerves are overstimulated. More of the cordial will calm her and allow her to develop properly." This advice, though well-intentioned, was exactly backward. Caroline was lethargic because of the opium, not despite it. Her small size and developmental delays were consequences of chronic narcotic exposure. Increasing the dose would make these problems worse, not better. But Elizabeth, trusting her doctor's expertise, followed his advice. She increased Caroline's dose of cordial, and the baby became even more somnolent, even less responsive. Elizabeth watched her daughter with growing anxiety, sensing that something was wrong. But unable to identify what, unable to see the connection between the medicine she was giving and the problems she was observing. The turning point came when a friend from Elizabeth's childhood visited from the countryside. Margaret had married a farmer and lived a life very different from Elizabeth's urban, middle-class existence. She had 5 children, all healthy and boisterous, raised without the benefit of modern medicine or patent remedies. Margaret visited for a week, and she observed Caroline with frank concern. "Elizabeth," she said on the 3rd day of her visit, speaking with the directness that only old friends can manage, "something is wrong with that child. She's like a little ghost, barely here. What are you giving her?" Elizabeth, defensive, described the Godfrey's cordial, the doctor's recommendations, the universal assurance that such preparations were safe and necessary. Margaret's face darkened. "Opium," she said flatly. "You're giving that baby opium, multiple times a day. Elizabeth, that's what's wrong with her." "The medicine isn't helping, it's poisoning her," Elizabeth protested, cited her doctor's authority, mentioned all the other mothers who used similar preparations. But Margaret was adamant, and her certainty planted a seed of doubt. After Margaret left, Elizabeth couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. She began to pay closer attention to Caroline's patterns, noticing how the baby was most alert and engaged in the period before her dose of cordial, how she became increasingly drowsy and unresponsive after taking it, how she seemed to cry most desperately when the medicine was wearing off. It was a pattern consistent with drug dependence, though Elizabeth didn't have that vocabulary. She just knew with growing certainty that something about the cordial was wrong, that her friend's simple observation had exposed a truth she'd been too trusting to see. She decided, without consulting her doctor, to stop giving Caroline the cordial. She simply didn't administer the next scheduled dose, then steeled herself for what might come. What came was terrible. Within hours, Caroline began to cry, a desperate, inconsolable wailing that went on for hours. Her small body trembled. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, seemed to be in genuine distress. After 6 hours of this, Elizabeth's nerve broke and she gave the baby a dose of cordial. Caroline calmed immediately and fell into a deep sleep. But now Elizabeth understood. The cordial wasn't treating Caroline's distress. It was causing it. The baby's desperate crying wasn't natural infant fretfulness. It was withdrawal from a drug Elizabeth had been giving her since infancy. This realization was devastating. Elizabeth had been trying to be a good mother, had followed medical advice, had done what everyone said was right, and in doing so she'd addicted her daughter to opium, had unknowingly caused the very problem she'd been trying to solve. The guilt was crushing, but Elizabeth forced herself past guilt to action. If Caroline was dependent on opium, she would need to be gradually weaned off it. Stopping suddenly was clearly too traumatic. So Elizabeth began reducing the dose slowly, giving slightly less each day, stretching the time between doses. It was difficult. Caroline cried more, slept less, seemed uncomfortable and distressed. But gradually, over several weeks, Elizabeth noticed improvements. As the cordial doses decreased, Caroline became more alert, more responsive. She began to smile and laugh. Her movements became livelier. She seemed, for the first time in months, like a real baby rather than a sedated doll. Elizabeth told no one what she was doing, afraid of judgment, afraid of being told she was wrong. But when her doctor next visited and commented on how much better Caroline looked, how much more developed she seemed, Elizabeth simply said she'd made some changes to Caroline's routine and didn't elaborate. The doctor accepted this vague explanation and moved on to other topics. He didn't ask if she was still using Godfrey's cordial, didn't inquire about what changes she'd made. His lack of curiosity struck Elizabeth as telling. He'd prescribed the cordial, had assured her of its safety, but he wasn't really invested in understanding its effects. He'd done what doctors did, dispensed standard advice, and moved on. Elizabeth's experience gave her a new perspective on medical authority. She'd always deferred to doctors, assumed they knew best. Now she understood that doctors could be wrong, that they might recommend treatments that were harmful, that maternal instinct and careful observation might sometimes be more reliable than professional expertise. This was a radical realization for a Victorian woman, a challenge to the era's hierarchies of knowledge and authority. But Elizabeth couldn't unlearn what she now knew. She'd seen the evidence too clearly. The cordial had harmed her daughter, and stopping it had helped her thrive. She began talking cautiously with other mothers, asking about their use of soothing syrups and cordials, sharing her own experience obliquely. She found that many mothers had similar unease, had noticed connections between the medicines they were giving and problems their children experienced, but had dismissed these observations because doctors and authorities said the medicines were safe. Some mothers were receptive to Elizabeth's concerns. Others were defensive, unwilling to question practices they'd been using for years, unwilling to face the possibility that they'd been harming their children. The topic was too fraught, too bound up with questions of maternal competence and guilt. But gradually, whispered conversations among mothers began to shift practices. Some women reduced their use of opiate preparations. Some stopped using them entirely. Information spread through informal networks, through tea-time conversations and social calls, through the kinds of communication channels that didn't leave written records, but that shaped behavior nonetheless. This grassroots change among mothers preceded and probably contributed to the eventual medical and regulatory reforms that would limit opiate use. The pattern was significant. Official change often followed changes in practice that ordinary people, particularly women, had already begun implementing based on their own observations and experiences. But progress was slow, and many children continued to suffer. The patent medicine industry was entrenched and profitable. Chemists resisted regulation that would limit their sales. Doctors continued to prescribe opiate preparations, and new mothers, told by everyone around them that these products were safe and necessary, continued to use them. The cultural ideal of the calm, peaceful Victorian nursery, maintained through chemical sedation of infants, proved remarkably persistent. Images of sleeping babies, perfect children who never fussed or cried, were everywhere in art and literature, reinforcing the idea that this was normal and achievable, that any mother whose child didn't conform to this ideal was somehow failing. The reality that infants naturally cry, that parenting is exhausting, that the serene Victorian domestic scene was often achieved through drugs, remained largely hidden. Each new generation of mothers confronted these challenges as if they were unique, without benefit of honest information about what infant care actually entailed and what methods other mothers used to cope. Elizabeth, watching Caroline grow into a healthy, lively toddler, sometimes thought about writing about her experience, publishing an article or pamphlet warning other mothers about Godfrey's cordial and similar preparations. But she never did. The social risks were too great. Admitting publicly that she drugged her infant daughter, even inadvertently, would expose her to scandal and judgment. Her husband's business reputation might suffer. They might be excluded from respectable society. So she remained silent publicly while spreading information privately, through those whispered conversations with other mothers. It was the most she felt she could safely do, and perhaps it was enough. Perhaps these small acts of sharing information, these quiet warnings between women, accumulated into significant change, even if the change was invisible in official records and public discourse. The broader story of opiate use in Victorian society is inseparable from the story of women's lives and the constraints women faced. Women were prescribed opiates more frequently than men, used them more regularly, and suffered the consequences more severely. This was partly because of medical theories that viewed women as naturally weak and prone to nervous disorders, and partly because women's lives, particularly middle-class women's lives, were often so circumscribed and frustrating that drugs offered one of the few available escapes. A Victorian middle-class woman had limited options for managing stress or unhappiness. She couldn't easily leave an unhappy marriage. She couldn't pursue a career or independent life. She was expected to find complete fulfillment in domestic life, in caring for husband and children, in managing a household. When this prescribed role proved unsatisfying or overwhelming, she had few legitimate outlets for expressing dissatisfaction. Laudanum offered relief without rebellion. A woman could take her dose of medicine, prescribed by a doctor, and feel her anxieties fade, her sadness lift, her circumstances become more bearable. She could continue fulfilling her domestic duties while existing in a slight chemical haze that made those duties more tolerable. This dynamic, using drugs to enable women to tolerate circumstances that might otherwise be intolerable, was rarely acknowledged openly. It was disguised as medical treatment for nerves, or hysteria, or other vague conditions. But the effect was to medicate women into compliance with social roles, to chemically enforce conformity with Victorian ideals of femininity. Some Victorian women became seriously addicted to laudanum, their entire lives structured around their doses, their personalities altered by chronic opiate use. But many others used opiates more moderately, as occasional relief from pain or distress. The line between use and abuse was blurry, and the concept of addiction as a disease was not well developed. Famous Victorian women struggled with opiate addiction. Elizabeth Barrett Browning took laudanum regularly for much of her life, ostensibly for pain related to a childhood injury, but arguably also for anxiety and depression. Her poetry sometimes reflects the dreamy, detached state that laudanum can produce. Wilkie Collins, though male, had a profound laudanum addiction that shaped his writing. His novel, The Moonstone, features characters struggling with opiate addiction, reflecting his own experiences. These literary examples hint at how pervasive opiate use was among educated, respectable Victorians. If famous poets and novelists were using laudanum regularly, how many ordinary people were doing the same? The intersection of opiate use with motherhood was particularly complex. Motherhood was supposed to be women's highest calling, their natural destiny, the source of their deepest fulfillment. Victorian culture produced endless literature about maternal love, about the sacred bond between mother and child, about the instinctive wisdom and patience mothers possessed. This ideology left no room for acknowledging that motherhood could also be difficult, exhausting, sometimes overwhelming. It left no room for maternal ambivalence, for moments when a mother might wish to be anywhere but with her crying infant, for the simple truth that caring for babies is hard work, that doesn't always feel transcendent or fulfilling. Opiate preparations for infants allowed mothers to maintain the fiction of effortless maternal bliss. A crying baby could be transformed into a peaceful one, with a few drops of cordial. The mother could then perform the role society expected: serene, patient, perpetually loving. But this came at tremendous cost. The babies were drugged. Their natural development was impaired. Some died, and mothers were denied the opportunity to learn genuine coping skills, to develop realistic expectations, to build support systems based on honesty about the challenges of infant care. The cycle perpetuated itself. Women who'd grown up being dosed with opiate preparations as infants, who'd been raised by mothers using laudanum for their nerves, became mothers themselves who naturally turned to the same chemical solutions. It was normalized, invisible, rarely questioned. Breaking this cycle required not just medical reform or pharmaceutical regulation, but a broader cultural shift in how motherhood was understood and discussed. It required acknowledging that motherhood was work, often difficult work, and that mothers needed practical support rather than being expected to handle everything perfectly with only chemical assistance. This shift began in the late 19th century, with the emergence of more realistic childcare literature, with the work of reformers who advocated for maternal and infant health, with gradually changing medical understanding of child development and pharmaceutical safety. But the full shift took decades, well into the 20th century. Even after the dangers of opiates were widely recognized, even after regulations limited their sale, cultural pressure on mothers to appear perpetually capable and serene continued. The specific tool changed. Mothers stopped using opiate cordials, but the underlying pressure to present an idealized image of motherhood while hiding struggles remained. Elizabeth Hartley's daughter Caroline grew up healthy, suffering no apparent long-term effects from her infant exposure to opium. This was fortunate. Many children were not so lucky, but the experience shaped Elizabeth's understanding of motherhood, medicine, and authority in ways that lasted her lifetime. When Caroline was older and had children of her own, Elizabeth warned her about soothing syrups and patent medicines, shared her own experience, encouraged her daughter to trust her instincts even when they conflicted with medical advice. This intergenerational transmission of knowledge, from mother to daughter, was how many harmful practices were eventually eliminated, even before official reform and regulation. The role of women's informal knowledge networks in changing medical practices deserves recognition. Throughout history, women have shared information about childbirth, infant care, health remedies, and survival strategies through conversations, through observation, through the kinds of oral tradition that rarely gets recorded, but that shapes how people actually live. These networks were particularly important for practices related to reproduction and childcare, areas where women often had more practical experience than male doctors. A doctor might have theoretical knowledge from medical training, but a mother who'd raised 6 children had empirical knowledge from direct experience. Victorian medicine gradually became more willing to acknowledge and incorporate this experiential knowledge, though the process was slow and uneven. The development of scientific pediatrics in the late 19th and early 20th centuries involved systematically studying what experienced mothers had learned through practice, codifying that knowledge, and combining it with new scientific understanding of child development. But this process also involved appropriating women's knowledge, crediting it to male physicians who documented it, and then using that documentation to claim authority over infant care practices. Women's experiential knowledge was simultaneously valued and devalued, incorporated but not credited. The story of opiate use in Victorian motherhood is thus also a story about knowledge, authority, and whose voices are heard. Mothers knew things about infant care, about how babies responded to various substances, about connections between medications and problems. But when mothers raised concerns, they were often dismissed or ignored. When doctors made the same observations, they were credited with scientific discoveries. This pattern of knowledge appropriation, where women's practical understanding is taken and recoded as masculine scientific knowledge, has been repeated throughout medical history. It's visible in the development of anesthesia for childbirth, in the professionalization of midwifery and obstetrics, in countless areas where women's traditional knowledge was systematized and claimed by male professionals. Recognizing this pattern doesn't diminish the genuine advances that came from scientific medicine, but it reminds us to ask whose knowledge counts, whose voices are heard, whose experiences are taken seriously. And it reminds us that progress often comes from listening to those most directly affected by practices and policies. In this case, mothers and babies. The gradual elimination of opiate preparations for infants from the 1860s through the early 1900s involved multiple factors: medical reform, pharmaceutical regulation, consumer advocacy, changing cultural attitudes, and quiet resistance from mothers who observed problems and changed their practices. No single factor was sufficient. All were necessary. By the early 20th century, the use of opiate cordials for infants had become rare and was increasingly seen as old-fashioned and dangerous. The development of alternative remedies, some effective, others merely less harmful, gave parents options. Better understanding of infant development made it clear that some fussiness and crying were normal and didn't require medication. But this progress wasn't universal or complete. In rural areas and among poor populations, patent medicines containing opiates remained available and popular for decades longer. In some communities, traditional practices of using opiate preparations persisted well into the mid-20th century, and new forms of pharmaceutical overuse emerged. As each generation of dangerous drugs was regulated, new substances were marketed as safe alternatives, often without adequate testing or understanding of long-term effects. The specific substance changed, but the underlying dynamic, pharmaceutical companies profiting from people's desperation and vulnerability, remained. The history of opiate use in Victorian medicine is thus not just a historical curiosity, but a reminder of ongoing challenges. How do we balance the genuine benefits of pharmaceutical treatments with awareness of potential harms? How do we ensure that medications are tested adequately, that risks are communicated honestly, that profit motives don't override safety concerns? How do we support parents, particularly mothers, in ways that don't require chemical solutions to normal developmental challenges? These questions remain relevant today. In a world where pharmaceutical companies market widely, where new drugs are constantly introduced, where parents face enormous pressure to manage children's behavior through medication. The Victorian mothers who used Godfrey's cordial and similar preparations weren't ignorant or careless. They were doing what everyone told them was right, using products that were widely available and officially sanctioned, trying to be good parents in difficult circumstances. The system failed them, failed their babies, through a combination of inadequate regulation, profit-driven marketing, limited medical understanding, and cultural pressures that made honest discussion of parenting challenges difficult. Understanding this history helps us see current pharmaceutical practices with more critical eyes. When new medications are marketed heavily, when they're presented as solutions to common problems, when assurances of safety come primarily from those who profit from sales, we have reason to be cautious. The Victorian experience with opiate infant medicines teaches us that official approval and widespread use don't guarantee safety, that years or even decades might pass before harms are fully recognized and addressed. The mothers who questioned these practices, who noticed problems and changed their behavior despite official assurances, who shared information through informal networks, were practicing a form of grassroots public health activism. They didn't wait for official reform. They protected their children as best they could with the knowledge they had. This kind of activism, observing, questioning, sharing information, making changes in practice, remains important. Official systems change slowly. In the meantime, people make decisions based on their own observations and values, protecting themselves and their families as best they can. Elizabeth Hartley's decision to stop giving her daughter Godfrey's cordial, based on her own observations and her friend's warning, was an act of maternal authority that contradicted medical advice. It required her to trust her own judgment over expert opinion, to value her experiential knowledge over professional credentials. For a Victorian woman, this was radical. Women were supposed to defer to male authority, particularly in areas like medicine where professional expertise was involved. By deciding for herself that the doctor was wrong, that the medicine was harmful despite official assurances otherwise, Elizabeth was asserting a kind of autonomy and authority that Victorian gender ideology sought to deny women. This pattern, women making decisions about their own and their children's bodies that contradicted official medical advice, has been repeated throughout history. From refusing procedures they deemed unnecessary or dangerous to seeking alternative treatments, to simply trusting their own observations about what helped or harmed, women have often had to practice a kind of quiet resistance to protect themselves and their families. This resistance doesn't always get recorded in history books or medical journals. It happens in private, in homes, in conversations between women. But its effects are real and significant, shaping health practices and outcomes in ways that official medicine often doesn't recognize. The story of laudanum and Victorian mothers is ultimately a story about power. Who has it, who exercises it, who benefits, and who suffers from its exercise. Pharmaceutical companies had power through their products and marketing. Doctors had power through their professional authority. Men had power through their control of public discourse and decision-making. Mothers had less obvious power, but they had it nonetheless, the power to observe, to question, to share information, to make daily decisions about their children's care. When mothers collectively began to recognize that opiate preparations were harmful, when they began to reduce or eliminate their use, change happened, even before official reform. This kind of power, the aggregate power of individual decisions and informal information networks, is easy to overlook but shouldn't be underestimated. Social change often begins this way, with people observing problems, sharing concerns, modifying their behavior, creating momentum that eventually forces official systems to respond. The Victorian opiate crisis, particularly as it affected infants and children, was eventually addressed through combination of medical reform, pharmaceutical regulation, and changing consumer behavior. All three were necessary. Medical reform without regulation would have left dangerous products on the market. Regulation without changing medical practice would have been circumvented. Neither reform nor regulation would have been effective if consumers hadn't been willing to change their behavior. This multifaceted approach to addressing pharmaceutical harms offers lessons for contemporary challenges. Complex problems require multiple solutions. Official action is necessary but not sufficient. Individual and collective choices matter. Information, particularly information shared through informal networks, can drive change even when official sources resist. The children of the Victorian era who were dosed with opiate preparations, who suffered or died from medications their parents believed were safe, deserve to be remembered. Their suffering was real. Their deaths were preventable. And their stories should inform how we think about pharmaceutical safety, medical authority, and parental responsibility. But we should also remember the mothers who questioned, who observed, who trusted their instincts, even when authorities told them they were wrong. These mothers, like Elizabeth Hartley, who made the difficult decision to stop using a widely recommended product because her own observations suggested it was harmful, were pioneers of evidence-based parenting, of critical thinking about medical authority, of maternal advocacy. Their quiet resistance, their willingness to trust their own observations and to share information with other mothers, contributed to changing practices and ultimately to saving lives. They deserve recognition not as perfect or heroic figures, but as ordinary people who faced difficult choices and did their best to protect their children with the knowledge and resources available to them. The Laudanum Dream, the fantasy that difficult aspects of life could be chemically managed, that parenting could be made easy through pharmaceutical assistance, that suffering could be eliminated through medicine, proved to be exactly that, a dream. Reality was more complicated, more difficult, and ultimately more honest. Learning to parent without chemical shortcuts, to manage infant distress through patience and presence rather than sedation, to acknowledge that crying and sleeplessness are normal parts of infancy rather than problems requiring medication. These represented progress, even though they made parenting more difficult in some ways. The Victorian mothers who used Godfrey's cordial weren't weak or incompetent for seeking help. But the help they were given was false help, creating more problems than it solved. Real help would have been practical support, honest information, realistic expectations, and acknowledgement that parenting is genuinely difficult work deserving of social support. As we look back on the Victorian era's pharmaceutical practices, particularly regarding mothers and children, we see a society that failed to provide genuine support while offering harmful substitutes. We see profit prioritized over safety, convenience over health, maintaining appearances over acknowledging reality. These are failures we can learn from, patterns we can recognize and resist in our own time. Because the fundamental dynamic, the temptation to chemically manage normal human experiences, to market substances as solutions to life's difficulties, to prioritize profit over people, hasn't disappeared. It just takes new forms, uses new substances, finds new populations to target. The story of laudanum and Victorian mothers is a reminder to question authority, to trust observation, to share information, to resist easy solutions to complex problems. It's a reminder that those most affected by policies and practices, in this case mothers and babies, often recognize problems before official systems do. And it's a reminder that change, when it comes, often begins quietly, with individuals making different choices, sharing information, building networks of resistance that eventually force broader systemic change. In the darkness of Victorian nurseries, mothers gave their babies drops of opiate cordial, believing they were providing comfort and care. In the light of historical understanding, we see that they were often causing the problems they sought to solve, trapped in cycles of dependence and withdrawal that harmed the children they loved. But we also see that some mothers noticed, questioned, changed course. Some trusted their observations over expert assurances, some chose difficulty over false solutions, and their choices, accumulated across thousands of households and dozens of years, helped create the change that official systems eventually recognized and codified. The Laudanum Dream ended not with a single dramatic moment, but with gradual awakening, with growing recognition that the pharmaceutical promise of easy parenting was false, with acceptance that genuine care requires presence, attention, and honesty rather than chemical solutions. That awakening, painful and slow as it was, represents progress worth remembering and protecting.